There are certain signals that only appear when the world becomes quiet enough. They drift through the air unnoticed most of the time, lost among stronger broadcasts, distant towers, and the steady noise of ordinary life. But deep in the mountains, where valleys sink low between ridges and the air feels strangely still, unusual things sometimes slip through the static. Old radios pick them up now and then, faint voices speaking across frequencies that shouldn't carry that far. Most hikers who hear them assume it's a distant station bouncing off the atmosphere, or a damaged receiver struggling to find a signal. A few write it down in journals and forget about it later, and a very small number decide to follow the sound. Far from any well-known trail, the valley where the signal appeared rested quietly between two long ridgelines of dark evergreen forest. To reach it, one had to leave the marked paths miles earlier and follow an aging service road that no longer showed up on modern maps. The road itself had begun to fade back into the forest, its gravel edges softened by moss, with small clusters of grass pushing through the cracks. Fallen branches lay scattered across its surface, suggesting that very few travelers had passed through in years. At the end of the road, a rusted metal gate hung loosely from a single hinge. Beyond it stretched a narrow trail leading into the trees, little more than a faint line of flattened needles between the trunks. A traveler arrived there in the late afternoon, carrying small pack, moving at the slow pace of someone with no fixed schedule. The air was cool and still, and the sky above the valley held the pale color of fading daylight. The traveler stepped around the fallen gate and continued along the narrow trail as the forest slowly closed in. Tall pines stood close together, their branches forming a high, dim ceiling, letting only thin ribbons of light reach the ground. The earth beneath each step felt soft, layered with decades of fallen needles, and damp soil carrying the scent of moss and bark. Somewhere deeper in the woods, water moved quietly over stones, suggesting a stream hidden beyond the trees. It was the kind of place where sounds carried strangely far, yet always seemed softened at the edges. The traveler paused now and then, studying the folded map pulled from a jacket pocket. The map showed a faint ranger trail, following the valley floor, before eventually reaching a small observation station marked decades earlier. The structure no longer appeared on most modern maps, though older survey documents still listed it. Curiosity had been the only real reason for coming this far. By the time the traveler reached the stream, the forest had grown noticeably quieter. The water crossed the trail in a shallow ribbon, barely reaching the ankles as it slid between rounded stones. A fallen log formed a natural bridge, worn smooth by time and weather. The traveler stepped carefully across it and paused on the far bank, lifting a metal canteen for a slow drink. The air carried the faint chill that often settles into valleys as evening approaches. After a few moments of quiet rest, the traveler adjusted the small radio receiver clipped to the side of the pack. It was an old handheld model, the kind used for listening to weather updates in remote places. Normally, it stayed silent in places like this, where mountains blocked most transmissions. But as the receiver clicked on, a faint crackle of static drifted from the tiny speaker. At first, the traveler barely noticed the sound. Static in mountain valleys was common when a receiver searched for distant weather stations. The dial was turned slowly, sweeping through quiet frequencies where nothing but soft white noise lived. The antenna was extended and tilted slightly toward the ridgeline, a habit developed from years of hiking. The static changed subtly with each small movement, rising and falling, like wind through dry leaves. For several seconds, nothing else appeared. Then, a thin thread of sound slipped through the noise. It was faint enough that the traveler almost mistook it for imagination. The voice became clearer as the dial moved a fraction further, spoken in a calm, measured tone, almost drifting above the soft static that wrapped around it. The words arrived slowly, unhurried, as if the speaker had nowhere else to be and no reason at all to rush. Conditions remain clear along the southern trail, the voice said quietly. The traveler paused, frozen for a moment, listening with careful attention. There was no call sign, no station identification, none of the usual background music. Only the voice and the faint hiss of a distant signal fading and returning. The traveler looked down at the receiver again, studying the frequency window. It didn't match any local weather channel. "Stop here!" The traveler raised the radio slightly closer to listen, the voice continuing in that same steady tone. "A lone hiker has now reached the crossing stream. The water level remains low this evening." For a moment, the traveler assumed it was some type of ranger broadcast describing trail conditions. But the phrasing felt oddly specific. The mention of a lone hiker caused a brief pause of confusion. The traveler looked around instinctively, scanning the quiet forest. No one else stood nearby. The stream moved quietly behind them, and the forest remained still. The voice continued without hesitation. "The traveler will pause here briefly before continuing north along the valley path." The words settled in the air with an unsettling calmness. The traveler lowered the radio slowly, feeling the small speaker still murmuring against the static. For a moment, there was only silence from the forest itself. No wind stirred the branches. No footsteps approached from the trail. The traveler glanced again toward the direction of the stream crossing. The voice had just described what had already happened only moments earlier. Curiosity replaced confusion more quickly than fear. The traveler lifted the receiver again and turned the dial slightly to see if the signal would vanish. The voice wavered, but did not disappear. The words returned through the static, as clearly as before. "The traveler will soon continue along the trail. Ahead, the valley will narrow and the trees will grow thicker." The calm narration continued, as though reading from a script written long before. The traveler stood quietly for several seconds, unsure whether to treat the moment as coincidence or something stranger. Then, almost without thinking, the traveler stepped forward along the path again. The forest ahead did exactly as the voice had suggested. The valley narrowed slowly, gently, and the tall trees began to draw closer together as the trail climbed upward. The ground darkened, growing cooler, where the sunlight could no longer slip through the branches above. The traveler moved with quiet care, the small radio murmuring softly from the side of the pack. From time to time, the voice within faded into static before returning again with its calm observations. It spoke of bends in the trail only moments before they appeared. It mentioned a cluster of fallen trees that soon came into view ahead. The tone never shifted, never reacted, never acknowledged the traveler at all. Eventually, the trail curved around a rocky outcrop where the valley opened slightly again. The traveler paused there, standing on a flat patch of ground that overlooked a wider stretch of forest below. Evening light filtered through distant branches, turning the air pale gold between the trees. The radio speaker crackled softly before the voice returned. "The traveler will soon notice the old station," it said. The traveler felt a small tightening of curiosity at the words. The map had mentioned a ranger station somewhere deeper in the valley, though there had been no guarantee it still existed. The voice continued calmly through the static. "The building remains where it has always been." The traveler stood quietly on the rocky overlook for several seconds after the voice mentioned the station. The forest below looked ordinary enough, a long stretch of dark pines and pale stones fading into the deepening evening light. Nothing suggested the presence of any building or structure hidden among the trees. The radio rested in one hand, its faint static blending with the distant hush of the valley. For a moment, the voice said nothing more, as if allowing the traveler time to absorb the quiet statement. Then the signal returned with the same calm rhythm as before. "The station stands beyond the bend where the ridge begins to fall away." The words sounded less like guidance and more like observation. The traveler folded the old map slowly and slipped it back into the pack. Curiosity had now grown into a quiet determination to see whether the voice was describing something real. The trail continued forward, narrowing as it moved deeper between the trees. Twilight had begun to gather along the forest floor, softening the colors of bark and stone into muted shades of gray and green. Pine needles muffled each step so completely that the traveler could barely hear their own movement. The radio murmured faintly from the open air, still catching fragments of the distant broadcast. Every so often, the voice slipped through again, describing the path ahead with unsettling accuracy. "The traveler moves past the fallen cedar," it said softly, just moments before the trunk appeared across the trail. The traveler stepped over the rotting wood and continued forward, glancing occasionally at the receiver, as though expecting it to change shape in their hand. No call sign ever interrupted the broadcast. No music filled the pauses between sentences. A cool breeze finally moved through the valley, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant water. The trees ahead grew darker as the sky slowly faded toward evening blue. The traveler walked another few minutes before the trail bent gently around a rise in the terrain. At that moment, the radio voice returned once more. "Beyond this turn, the station becomes visible for the first time." The traveler slowed slightly, uncertain whether to believe the claim. The trail curved around a cluster of large boulders and dipped downward through a patch of young fir trees. As the branches parted, a structure appeared in the distance exactly where the voice had suggested. It stood quietly in a small clearing halfway down the slope. The building modest and square, built from dark timber that had faded with age. A narrow porch faced the trail, its railing slightly crooked where time had loosened the joints. The roof sagged gently in the middle, though the structure itself remained intact. A tall metal antenna extended from one corner of the roof, leaning slightly, as if it had been pushed by years of mountain wind. The traveler paused at the edge of the clearing and studied the scene. The radio crackled again, almost softly pleased with itself. The traveler has now reached the ranger station. The clearing around the building had grown thick with tall grass and scattered weeds. No recent footprints marked the soil, and the path leading to the porch had nearly vanished beneath layers of fallen needles. The traveler approached slowly, noticing how quiet the forest had become again. Even the breeze seemed to hesitate at the edge of the clearing. The wooden steps creaked gently under the traveler's weight as they climbed onto the porch. Dust coated the window glass in a thin gray film that softened the shapes inside. The radio continued its quiet murmur. "The station has not been used for many years." The front door resisted at first when pushed. Its hinges gave a low groan before finally allowing the door to swing inward. A faint smell of dry wood and old paper drifted out from the dark interior. The traveler stepped inside and paused to let their eyes adjust to the dimness. The room appeared to be a single workspace once used by forest rangers long ago. A wooden desk stood near the center, surrounded by scattered chairs and shelves lined with weathered equipment. Dust lay thick across every surface. The only sound came from the small radio in the traveler's hand. "Records remain inside," the voice said calmly. The traveler approached the desk and noticed several journals stacked near one corner, their covers worn and faded, each marked with dates written in careful handwriting. Some were older than expected, stretching back decades before modern hiking trails had been built in the valley. The traveler opened one slowly, turning the stiff pages with cautious fingers. The entries inside described routine ranger patrols and weather observations at first. But several pages later, the writing changed slightly, becoming more uncertain. One line stood out clearly beneath the dim light, drifting through the dusty window. "The radio is speaking again tonight." The traveler flipped through more pages, reading quietly, while the forest darkened outside. The journal entries described a strange broadcast, appearing occasionally on the station receiver. The voice, according to the ranger who wrote the notes, described small events around the valley before they happened. At first, the ranger believed it was some experimental signal from a nearby observation tower. Later entries suggested a different conclusion. One page ended with a sentence written slightly more carefully than the rest. "The signal knows where I am standing." The traveler closed the journal slowly and glanced around the room again. In the far corner stood an old metal radio console mounted on a narrow table. Thick wires connected it to the leaning antenna outside, though the equipment looked far too old to still function. Dust covered the dials and switches in a thick layer, suggesting no one had touched them for many years. The traveler stepped closer, brushing a finger gently across one of the knobs. Beneath the dust, the metal surface still gleamed faintly. The handheld receiver suddenly crackled again behind them. The traveler is now looking at the station equipment. For a moment, the traveler simply listened to the voice echo softly through the room. The calm tone had never changed since the first broadcast beside the stream. It continued describing small details as though reading from a report already written somewhere else. The traveler will soon examine the remaining journals. The traveler returned to the desk and opened another notebook from the stack. This one belonged to a survey team that had apparently stayed at the station many years after the Ranger's final entries. Their notes contained similar observations about the signal. Several pages repeated the same unsettling question, in slightly different wording. How does it know? Outside the window, the forest had begun to fade into darkness, and the last pale glow of evening lingered above the distant ridges, turning the sky into a deep blue canopy. The traveler lit a small lantern found on the desk, filling the room with a soft amber light. Dust particles drifted slowly through the beam like tiny floating sparks. The radio voice returned once more after a brief silence. "Night has now reached the valley." The words felt heavier somehow inside the quiet cabin. The traveler sat down at the desk and opened the final journal in the stack. This one appeared older than the others, its cover cracked and nearly colorless with age. The first few pages described the early construction of the ranger station itself. But deeper into the journal, the entries began mentioning something unusual about the radio antenna. The ranger who wrote the notes had discovered a signal appearing only after sunset. It arrived at the same frequency every time. And according to the final entry, the voice had eventually begun describing things that had not yet happened. The lantern flickered softly as a colder wind moved outside. The traveler closed the final journal and looked around the quiet room again. The station felt less abandoned now, as if the voices recorded in the journals had never completely left. The handheld radio crackled once more. For the first time since the traveler had entered the station, the voice paused longer than usual before speaking. When it returned, the tone remained calm, but the words had changed slightly. "The traveler will remain inside the station tonight." The traveler listened to the sentence echo softly through the small speaker, and for a long moment the cabin remained completely still, except for the faint crackle of the signal. Outside, night had settled fully into the valley, turning the clearing beyond the windows into a dark shape surrounded by deeper shadows. The lantern on the desk cast a warm circle of light that barely reached the walls. Everything beyond that glow seemed to fade into quiet uncertainty. The traveler placed the radio gently beside the stack of journals and walked toward the window. Nothing moved outside except the slow swaying of tree branches in the cold night air. The forest looked calm, almost peaceful in the darkness, yet the traveler couldn't ignore the steady presence of the voice that had led them here. The radio spoke again after a few minutes of silence, its voice carrying that same patient distance as before. The traveler is now standing beside the eastern window. The traveler remained still, listening closely to the quiet forest outside. There was no sign of another person anywhere in the clearing. The antenna on the roof creaked faintly as the wind shifted, and the lantern flickered, letting the shadows inside the cabin stretch long across the floorboards. Then the voice continued, unhurried, observant. The traveler is wondering whether the signal has always been here. Slowly, the traveler turned back toward the desk. A chair scraped softly against the wooden floor as the traveler sat down again. The journals remained open where they had been left, their brittle pages filled with careful handwriting from people who had once heard the same broadcast. The traveler began reading again, this time more slowly. One of the later entries described a ranger who had attempted to trace the signal's source. According to the notes, he had followed the antenna line into the hills behind the station. The entry ended with a simple sentence written near the bottom of the page. The voice said, "I would find something in the trees." The traveler closed the journal and looked toward the dark doorway leading outside. The radio crackled quietly, as though waiting. After several seconds, the voice returned once more. "Behind the station, the old path still remains." The traveler glanced down at the receiver again. The calm narration continued without pause. "It begins where the grass meets the stones." The traveler felt the quiet suggestion hanging in the air. It was the first time the voice had mentioned a direction not already on the trail. Curiosity moved slowly but steadily. The traveler picked up the lantern and stepped toward the door. Outside, the clearing had grown colder beneath the open sky. The moon had not yet risen, leaving the valley dim, except for the faint lantern glow spreading across the ground. The forest surrounding the station formed a silent wall of dark trunks and tangled branches. The traveler walked carefully around the back of the building. There, just beyond the reach of the tall grass, a faint line of stones curved gently into the trees. It looked less like a trail and more like the remains of something that had once been used frequently, long ago. The radio murmured again from the traveler's hand, and the sound drifted softly through the stillness. "The path was built before the station," the voice said quietly. The traveler lifted the lantern slightly higher, letting its light fall across the narrow route. The stones continued uphill between the trees, disappearing into deeper darkness. The forest felt different in this direction, somehow older and heavier with silence. The traveler hesitated at the edge of the clearing. The voice continued calmly through the static. "The traveler will follow it for a short distance." For several moments, the traveler simply listened to the quiet valley behind them. The cabin's lantern glow stayed visible through the window, a small, warm square floating among the trees. Everything beyond that looked vast and uncertain. Finally, the traveler stepped onto the stone path. Each step carried them a little farther, into the forest behind the station. Pine branches hung lower here, brushing softly against the traveler's jacket. The radio remained quiet for nearly a full minute. Then the signal returned with a new line. "This trail was never placed on any map." The traveler continued walking slowly uphill, the lantern light bouncing gently across the stones. After several steps, the path curved between two large trees whose trunks had grown strangely close together. Their bark carried faint markings carved long ago. The traveler leaned closer, lifting the lantern toward the shapes. The symbols looked unfamiliar, almost like letters, but not belonging to any alphabet the traveler recognized. They formed a repeating pattern that continued around both trees. The radio crackled softly again. "Many travelers have stopped here." The traveler stepped back from the markings, feeling the forest pressing in quietly from all sides. The wind had faded completely, leaving the branches motionless above. For a moment, the valley seemed to hold its breath. The voice returned once more, slower than before. Most turned back. The traveler glanced behind them toward the direction of the station. The warm lantern glow from the window still flickered faintly through the distant trees. The path continued forward into deeper darkness, and the traveler stood there for a long, still moment, not moving, the small radio resting quietly in their hand. The voice remained silent for several long seconds, and when it finally spoke again, the words felt heavier than anything heard before. The traveler is now standing where the others stood. The traveler listened carefully to the quiet forest. Nothing answered. Then the voice spoke one final sentence. Beyond this point is the path that should never be followed. The traveler slowly turned back toward the cabin. The forest remained silent the entire walk downhill. When the traveler reached the clearing again, the lantern light from the station window had gone out. The radio produced only static. Some signals are never meant to be traced, and some trails are only discovered after it's already too late to forget them.